Chapter 5. Cade, for the second time in less than a day, found himself wandering through the woods, this time without even his bow.
Thanks again. I don't know what we'd do if we had to go without Bernard,
Sanders said with gratitude, but there was a heavy layer of worry still overlaying it all. You couldn't replace him? Cade asked as he passed around the rough trunk of an adolescent redwood. The dappled light of before had taken on an eerie orange glow from the setting sun, and the slanted light gave the trees a distinctly unbalanced feel. Gusts of wind spinning through the trees repeatedly picked up piles of leaves and sent them tumbling through the air, each one performing tiny cartwheels for an audience of two. A million shades of yellow, orange, and red danced playfully in the uneasy afternoon light.
No, my Da was serious. We're already behind the season. That's why Ma and Da brought us out here.
Sanders kicked a small pine cone and sent it spinning into the underbrush.
We need that coin, just to pay for coming out here. If we lose Bernard, then I don't know what we can do.
Cade stooped and picked up a hefty and relatively straight branch as he walked by it. Starting to spin it through his fingers while he walked, he gave Sanders what he felt was a reassuring smile and took the lead. The underbrush here was different to near Cade's home. More needles and slightly less large branches. Cade liked it. The pine needles made the ground softer, and it had a distinct smell that Cade liked. Cade was about to remark upon it, when a shrill scream came from off to their right. It was faint, quite a way off, but it was undoubtedly a fearful whinny from Bernard. Sanders and Cade spared a look to each other before they set off at a run. He hoped the horse was just spooked, but as they drew closer, the screams continued. Cade started to suspect he had stepped in a hole and broken a leg, that he was lying somewhere in pain. Sanders slipped behind as they ran, and Cade slowed slightly. He kept running with the stick, just in case it was something like a Vix, or a pack of the small hairless brage that were common in the area. As Sanders caught up, he and Cade passed through a tightly packed copse of juvenile spruce trees, and Cade's initial fear was confirmed. Bernard, laying on the ground, was still screaming. Must have stepped into a warren and broken his leg. Cade was sad to see it. He didn't even know what to do now. He had his belt knife, but was he really going to, stab it, slit its throat? As they approached, Sanders stopped and stuttered a quiet, Cade? Cade? Cade kept on and slowly started to realize the wrongness of the moment. He looked back to Bernard and noticed where he lay, his hind legs were totally still, and his back was bent at an odd angle. He was whipping his head around and foam was coursing from his mouth, and the screams. It wasn't right. Cade had heard a horse break its leg before. It was horrible to hear, but it lacked the terror and the urgency that this did. Cade stopped, and as he watched, a hand lifted up from behind and settled on the horse's belly. Cade's heart rate flew from fast to panicked in an instant. From behind the horse, a head lifted itself clear, covered in red viscera. Human eyes looked on from behind a long snout. Beneath the snout were twin rows of razor-sharp teeth, each like a miniature dagger. Miniature daggers set into a mouth without a lower jaw. As Cade stumbled backwards, the beast took its claws and scythed off a section of flesh, causing another horrific wail and a thrashing of the head from the still alive horse. It tore apart the flesh and threw back its head, revealing a black hole in its neck. Into its throat, it started to force the torn apart chunks of flesh. The deer struggled as it pushed each handful of meat into its throat using its palms, perhaps to avoid catching itself with the long talons that tipped its hands. The creature sounded like it was choking as it forced handful after handful of the red mess into the black pit. Each handful was carefully cut apart, but then awkwardly consumed in a strange display of dexterity and clumsiness. Much like Cade had the night before, Sanders froze, though this time Cade's mind was working just as it should. Every fibre of his being screamed to run. Cade dropped the length of wood and started to back away. So far, Rashin Dal hadn't seen them, and Cade begged the formers that it would stay that way. As he drew level with Sanders, he reached out and grabbed his friend by the sleeve and towed him backwards. Sanders, mumbling under his breath, complied, as if in a trance.
Dal. It's... Cade, that's Rashin Dal. Bernard. We have to get Bernard.
Shh. Sanders, come with me, okay? Sanders continued to follow, as if he had been hit on the head and struck simple. As they backed away, Cade took great pains to quiet his footfalls through the mess of pine needles, and he started every time a careless foot from Sanders caused a noise. They drew closer and closer to the line of thin trees that obscured their approach from view. Cade stepped between the tightly packed trees and took his eyes off Dal to make sure he wasn't going to snap any branches as he passed. Once through the narrower part, he spoke through gritted teeth to get Sanders to do the same. after the third time trying to get Sandus's attention. In the centre of the copse of trees, Rush and Dahl slowly rose from the still screaming horse. His limbs were unnaturally long, and all of his body was covered in a dark, matted hair, but pale white skin could be seen beneath. At full height he was massive, easily bigger than a man, and though he stood hunched over, and his limbs gave him a lanky, ungainly appearance, his arms were still rippling with long corded muscle. As he stood, he reached out a long arm and wrapped a talon hand around Bernard's throat. With a casual pull, the claws tore out esophagus and arteries in one smooth motion. The screaming stopped. Cade shook, though, as, while he did it, Russian's eyes were locked on the two small boys. "Run, Sandus, please." Russian Dahl dropped his arms to the ground and lurched forward with terrible speed, in a jarring, disjointed shamble. He rushed forward on all fours, but it had the character of a child trying to run on hands and feet, rather than a creature designed to hunt on four legs. Cade rushed forward and pulled Sandus hard towards the trees and shouted as loudly as he could, "Move, Sandus!" As Sandus fell through the tightly packed trees, Rushin collided with them. Not able to shove through, he reached a long arm between them and grasped at Sandus. This blessedly got him moving at long last. Cade pulled him to his feet, and the two set off towards the road, running for all they were worth. The small row of trees didn't slow Dahl much, and moments later, Cade could hear a horrible shambling disturbance of foliage growing closer and closer behind them. Cade didn't dare look behind, but he felt he shouldn't have to. It was so loud that surely he was right on top of them. His mind tumbled over itself. "Where's the damn road? We walked out here. We must have passed it by now." They started calling out as they ran, best as they could manage between deep, wheezing breaths. Then just ahead, and left a bit, he saw the orange-packed dirt of the road, and shouted at Sandus as he veered towards it. Sandus followed, and a moment later they tumbled down the embankment together. As they landed, Farland passed them, running the other way, and Cade heard a dull thud followed by a crash of leaves and branches. Tommen rushed to the boys, and as they picked themselves up with his help, Cade tried to reorient himself. The wagon was on the far side of the road from the embankment, and Emin and the cart were just in front of it, but off the road where someone had tied Sasha to a tree. Emin looked at Cade with a face that was pure relief to see him back and unharmed. Cade didn't have time to register it consciously, though, as his attention was pulled to the top of the embankment at the sound of a deep, guttural groan. A second later, Farland was knocked clean off the top of the dirt ridge, down to the hard-packed earth of the road. Dahl, from the top of the ridge, looked down at the family. He squeezed two fists together and held them to his chest in an expression that Cade could only assume was some horrific perversion of glee. A second later he was rushing down the dirt bank towards the family. Farland had found his feet, though, and moments before Dahl reached the wagon, Farland collided with him, full force. Cade noted in Farland's left hand he had put on some kind of steel gauntlet, each finger tipped in a hooked nail that he used to grab into the meat of Dahl's shoulder. With the armoured gauntlet he managed to stay in close to Dahl, and his weight pulled Dahl into a deeper stoop, whereupon Farland was raining blow after blow to the beast's head and neck. Cade was dimly aware of Miran and Tommen dragging Sandus between them and moving past him, perhaps to put the wagon between them and Dahl. As they passed, Cade heard Farland shout as Dahl tore the gauntlet off his shoulder and threw the bothersome human away. Farland flew back 10 paces and hit the wagon with a brutal crunch. Half of the side caved in around the Arnvart, and while he tried to free himself, Dahl turned to face Emin. The old man was trying to get to Cade and had made it halfway there from the cart. "No!" Cade cried as he launched himself towards his grander at the same time as Dahl. Cade reached him first and had only a moment to register the look of deep love and concern etched into Emin's features. Cade turned to face the Veer, set his feet, and gently reached back a hand to move his grandar back. As he did, he felt a tremendous wave of warmth course through his body. His vision swam with colours he had never seen before. Every part of his body was lanced with pins and needles. His ears rang with a single clear tone. In the fraction of a second the sensation grew 10-fold, then 100-fold. His vision blurred with so many foreign colours that he had trouble telling what was real and what was the swirling mess of lights. The warmth became fire in his chest, and the pins and needles became so strong that he wasn't sure where the different parts of his body ended. The ringing rose to a deafening sound that could have been one note or thousands. It all became one big knot of sensory information, and Cade's mind skipped several beats. But through it all, Cade could feel one salient thought where all others had vanished. "Look after my Da, won't you, lad?" He knew he needed to keep this vile monster from his grandeur. Dahl was on him a moment later, and a moment after that, a wicked claw was cleaving through the air. Cade raised his arms toward the Veer, and felt all the heat, all the colour, all the sensation pour out of his body and into the space between him and Dahl. The swirling colours left Cade's vision, and a bright flash entered it as a fireball formed in front of him. The ball of flame missed Cade by an arm's length, but engulfed Dahl. The dark pelt covering the creature's body instantly ignited, and an ear-splitting scream emanated from the Veer. Cade stumbled back from the blast, tripped, and landed hard on his back. His mind tried to make sense of what had transpired, but failed. An enraged Dahl violently flailed around, dropping to the ground and writhing as his body was racked with flames. The sound of agony emanating from the beast was painful to listen to. Somewhere off to Cade's right, Farlan had managed to extricate himself from the broken wreck of the wagon, and he could hear the family shouting, but his addled mind was at a loss for how to construct the noise into understandable words. As Cade's attention pulled back to Dahl, the flames slowly died down, revealing bright red skin, raw, awash with blisters, and dripping with blood from where Dahl's talons had sliced himself as he beat at the flames. Dahl rolled off his back and planted a clawed hand in the dirt, pushed himself up onto his knees, and then into a crouch. He then levelled hate-filled eyes at Cade. Cade tried to rise, but only managed to shuffle himself backwards as Dahl stomped towards him. Dimly, Cade registered a loud, splitting noise from somewhere off to his right. Moments later, as Dahl raised a clawed hand, Cade looked up just in time to see Farlan, armed with a long, thick length of wood torn from the side of the wagon, launch himself into the air in an arcing jump that shouldn't have been possible. He crested the arc and spun as he dropped, carrying the momentum through his landing and using the motion to swing the thick mass of wood in an impossibly powerful blow. The length of wood shattered into thousands of tiny splinters as it collided with Dahl's shoulders and back and sent the Veer tumbling. Farlan recovered quickly from the motion and placed himself between Dahl and Cade. Dahl stumbled to his feet and looked down at a ruined right arm. The flesh around his shoulder was torn, and from the limp way it hung by his side, it was likely dislocated. Farlan struck an impressive sight as he stared down a creature that, though heavily wounded, stood head and shoulders above him. "Leave while you're able, filth." It was hard to tell if the monster understood, but it returned another ear-splitting scream, drenched in rage, before backing away. Slowly, silently, Dahl entered the underbrush beyond the road. Cade shivered as he watched the monster silently fade into the woods, then started as Farlan dropped to a knee, breathing hard. "Farlan, are you—" "I'm fine, lad. I'm fine. I just don't have much left." Alrighty, so yeah, this is chapter 5. Pretty happy with this chapter. I just sort of like the content of it. This is something that sort of when they meet Rashin Dahl for the first time, the image of like a creature sort of trying in vain to eat, and like the way it moves, like when it runs, like it sort of runs on all fours like a child, but in that sort of, the way humans on all fours move doesn't look quite right, sort of in that similar sense. All that sort of stuff was really appealing to me when I was thinking about writing it, and I was sort of looking forward to this chapter a lot. This is also probably the first chapter where I start to incorporate a bit more of like the descriptions of things. So, for example, there's a bit about so Cade asked as he passed around the rough trunk of an adolescent redwood, the dappled light, took on an orange glow, etc., etc. Slanted light, leaves, tumbling through the forest, things like that. Not to say that that's particularly good or anything. It's just that in previous chapters, that didn't exist, and so I'm sort of starting to incorporate sort of more situationally descriptive things, which I think is probably important. It definitely doesn't flow quite right. Like, it still feels kind of awkward because, for example, when that description comes up, it's immediately following Sandus saying, "Thank you, Cade. Thanks for helping." And then Cade asks, "Could you replace him?" Cade asked as he passed around the rough trunk of an adolescent redwood, the dappled light. And so it sort of interrupts a conversation that they're having to do a description, which, and then, once the description is all finished, it comes back to Sandus, who says, "No, my dad was serious. We're already behind the season," which is kind of jarring, and it's hard for, naturally, it's very hard to have this big break in conversation, and then you come back, and then you go, okay, so what is Sandus currently replying to? So I need to get better at shifting where those descriptions come in and not interrupting sort of important things. I don't know if it's true for books, but I used Chekhov's stick in this. Cade stops and picks up a stick and while he's walking and spins it around his fingers, just as Sometimes you do when you're walking through the woods, but that stick has no relevance. So I don't know if that's kind of just weird or not, or if it's just normal for, in a book to have someone do something and then have nothing come of it. I feel like it's probably like a film. He probably shouldn't pick up a stick, a hefty straight stick if he's not going to do anything with it. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe when Dahl reaches through the tiny patch of trees that he can't get through, maybe Cade could hit him with the stick and then run. But yeah, I don't know. It's a bit weird. There's a little bit of an improvement in how much we're in Cade's head. There's some lines about, how he likes pine needles and the smell and stuff. And when he sees the horse on the ground, he's sad and he's unsure about what he's supposed to do. Like, he's got his belt knife. Is he supposed to, go over and stab this horse? And he's kind of nervous about it. Again, it's probably not enough. Like, you don't really know who Cade is, and you don't feel like you're sharing the moment with him. You're not in his shoes, but it's a step in the right direction. I think it's more familiarity with Cade that probably needs to come on much, much earlier and a decent amount stronger. But it's, obviously I'm still trying to work out how to do that. And, obviously, like I said, first book. Yeah. But, there's slight improvements in this chapter. I'm really happy with the chapter that describes, really happy with the bit that describes where Dahl is, what he's doing, how he's eating the horse, all the screams and things. I feel like the description there is something I'm happy with. I spent a little bit more time on that than probably most other things, not by much, but a little bit more. And so I like that. I like the way that Dahl runs. I did notice that my sentence structure is really, really poor. There's a lot of times where part of it is editing. I'm missing commas and using too many ands and little things like that make it. Basically, I just noticed when I was reading it out loud that sometimes it was very hard for me to even understand what I had written. It didn't flow like a sentence should. It got you confused, right towards the end, with what it was actually referring to. And so that's something I'm going to have to work on. I'm not sure how I'm going to work on that one, whether or not I need to do a bit of research into writing tips and how to structure a single sentence, or if I should just maybe do some writing and read what I've written out loud, not in the sense that I just did with this video, but in the sense that, with trying to pay attention to how to improve the structure of the sentence and just practice in that way, or if I should just pay more attention as I'm writing. So work on that one, I guess. So I think here's a good example of some things that I struggle with. So there's a moment where his mind tumbled over itself. Where's the damn road? We walked out here. We must have passed it by now. This doesn't come across as clearly as maybe it should. This is one of those moments where it's lacking sort of prerequisites for the sentence to make sense. Once you think about it a lot, it might become clear that what he's thinking, where is the damn road? We walked out here. We must have passed it by now. Is obviously that they came from the road, they walked to where Dahl is, and they've been running backwards for a while now. So they feel like, he feels like he should have hit the road by now because they walked out and he's now running. So where the hell's the road? But it doesn't quite come across as well as it should. I feel like there needs to be a sentence that's from the third person perspective that says, Cade felt like he'd been running forever, or something like that. Because then it may, he felt like he'd been running for ages, and then it goes into his mind tumbled over itself. Where's the damn road? We walked out here. We must have passed it by now. Then that sentence gets you in Cade's head, which is cool, which is just natural, but it makes sense with what it's supposed to describe, because the third person perspective has just told you that it's regarding the fact that he feels like he's been running forever. So it's I don't know. I just think it's hard to even explain why it makes more sense. I suppose language is sometimes like that, but in my head, having that line prior to, we walked out here, we must have passed it by now, makes it clear what the relevance of we walked out here means as a line of thought. But yeah. Initially, I was really worried that the way that Emmon looks at Cade, like he when he sees Cade come back, he looks at him and he, he's relieved and concerned, and there's an overflowing of love from the old man for his grandson. And when thinking back about this chapter, I was really worried that it was going to sound like there's this horrible monster has just appeared, and the grandfather, rather than looking at this giant creature, is just looking at Cade with love in his eyes, which seems kind of weird. But the way it actually came across when I read it out actually seemed to be pretty good. Like, the time that Emmon looks at Cade with love in his eyes is when Cade first appears out of the brush and like Farland's just run past and tackled the Veer. So like Emmon's had time to see the Veer, Farland's just attacked the thing, and then so you can it sort of makes a little bit more sense, I guess, why in that moment Emmon would look back to Cade and be relieved and loving. It doesn't seem, I think, as strange that he's just like ignoring this giant creature. In this next bit, it then does go. It's in the next bit. It's a little bit stranger because it says the old man was trying to get to Cade, and he made it halfway there from the cart. No, Cade cried as he launched himself towards his granda at the same time as Dahl. Cade reached him first and had only a moment to register the look of deep love and concern etched into Emmon's features. This bit is kind of strange because it's like Dahl and Cade are both sprinting towards this old man. Dahl's very, very close, and Emmon is apparently providing a look of deep love and concern. And that, it just doesn't seem like it's important that in this moment, Cade gets the impression from Emmon of deep love and deep care, because it's going to be relevant to what happens. Obviously, this is the moment in which Cade manifests some of the powers that you'll soon see in the rest of the book. But this is the moment where it occurs, and it's important that there's a strong sense of like love and connection and care involved. Not because that's how the powers work. It's just because the fact that they're so close to each other is how it is so easy for Cade to, as you'll soon see, steal a little bit of Emmon, which I will spoil by the end of this discussion, but it will, as we go, it'll make a bit more sense what his powers have actually done. Cade's mind skips beats far too much. Then I need to. I do this a lot as well. Like, if I want to say that someone has is starting to walk away, I say, Farland started heading for the wagon or whatever, and I use started all the time. Like, there's a lot of repeated phrases that I need to sort of expand and make a bit more creative and a bit less repetitive. But Cade's mind skipping beats, or there's a lot of them that undoubtedly you guys have noticed as while reading. But yeah, it bugs me. I really like that while Cade's dealing with all this sensory information that's just come in, which you will soon realize is because he has taken something from his granda. There's the one salient thought that breaks through is look after my granda, which is very important for Cade. Like, that's true to him, and I think it's just makes it even more crushing that that's the one thing that gets through, and it's the one thing he wants to do in this moment. And in him trying to do that, it's unfortunately killed his grandfather, which is not ideal. And so this next bit, I've actually added some edits into the document, or some places where I need to add edits, like some markers. But basically, when Cade, after he creates this big fireball and he stumbles over backwards, I need to add a part where he notices that Emmon has fallen with him, and Emmon is like on the ground and unresponsive. So, for example, and then a bit after that, moments later, Dahl raised a clawed hand. Cade looked up from Emmon's prone figure, which I didn't include in the reading, but he would need to, be somewhat paying attention to the fact that Emmon, basically, it can't just at the end of this paragraph when it just can't come out of nowhere that Emmon during that fight had
something had happened to him and he had fallen down. It sort of comes out of nowhere if you do it like that. So I need some bits where this is something I spoke about in the previous video, where I don't include certain portions that are quite important in previous bits. I just sort of all of a sudden something happens and it's not really set up, if that makes sense. So I need to work on that. I'd like to change it a little bit so that towards the end, when Farland's like, leave while you're able, filth, it's a little bit Saturday Disney hero sort of line. Maybe it'd be more interesting if, because Farland is sort of wrung out at this point and he doesn't have much energy left, it might be more interesting if under his breath he's mumbling something like, please give up, or please go, because he's hoping that he looks impressive and intimidating and Dahl runs away, but he knows that deep down he actually doesn't have much left. That would be maybe a little bit more honest and a little bit more towards Farland's character, because Farland isn't particularly like sort of heroic, silly bravado type lines. That's not really him. And then, so basically this is right at the end. Dahl dips off into the underbrush and Farland immediately drops to a knee. I should probably make this a little bit later, otherwise it would sort of just make sense for Dahl to just come back and smoke the dude because he can see that he's weak. Maybe Farland's the realization of Farland's sort of weakness needs to come a little bit later. It's not even particularly important, but I just sort of felt like it's good to put some limits on how strong this guy is. Like, he's the sort of person that can get thrown into a wagon and swing a giant wooden beam from that wagon so hard that it shatters. But, he needs to have some limits, and so he needs to be tired after this sort of thing. Or not he needs to be tired, but like, yeah, I just think it's good to have the bounds placed on him somewhere. And yeah, so that's the end of the chapter. And the only other bit that I was going to add is, that this is the moment where Cade manifests powers. And effectively what has happened, which will sort of potentially become more clear later, but I think it's worth mentioning here, I guess, is that because it's going to relate to some of the stuff I told you before, like why some of the things are important, I think, is because Emin is very familiar to Cade. So in this world, the way that energy works is that you can basically, so people like Cade specifically can control the energy of things. So like heat, kinetic energy, chemical energy internally, things like that. They can see light energy much more clearly. They can see heat in ways that normal humans can't. And so, but sorry, let me rephrase. If you wanted to take energy from something, that's easily done. But if you wanted to take the energy, sort of the soul of someone, basically, because I said in a previous video, the conceit of this book is that the soul is considered another type of energy. But that particular energy, if you wanted to steal it from someone, you would have to match the pulse with which it radiates away from someone, sort of like heat radiates away. So does the soul essence, and it's sort of restored with the functions of the body. But so it sort of pulses away, and it's got certain characteristics, like its size and shape matches that of the person it's in. It's got a certain brightness, which is sort of reminiscent of someone's strength, and the speed and rate at which it pulses away from somebody is related to how the anima or the soul from someone else can interact with it. So, for example, you can use your anima to push your anima outside of your body to, for example, you could direct it towards a fire to try and absorb the heat of that fire. You couldn't direct it into another person's body because your anima and that person's anima pulse at different rates, and so they sort of interfere with each other. But if you were to match them and get them, like if you were to meditate and or be intimately familiar with somebody, you can get your anima to pulse at the same rate as theirs, and they can interact then. And this is what, because Cade has lived with this man for his entire life, he just naturally has that familiarity with Emin, which allows him to, unfortunately, steal Emin's anima and use it to create this fireball that hits Rashin Dahl. Unfortunately, though, this kills Emin, and yeah, it's supposed to be pretty upsetting for Cade. And I think a lot of it is I don't know if it comes across as maybe as tragic as I want it to be, but it's intended to be it's have that sort of tragedy aspect that, he was trying to defend Emmon, and it's all inadvertently at his own fault. Like all of the steps along the way, leaving home, helping Sandus with the wagon, they were all things that he pushed for, but didn't. It's not his fault because he didn't know what was going to happen, but it is his fault by the same sense. And so I think that's really cool. But because of that, it's important, I think, for Emmon to give Cade certain sort of looks and make Cade feel sort of loved by him, so that he feels. Maybe it's not, because maybe he doesn't. He's going to feel guilty regardless. So I don't know if a loving look from Emmon is particularly required. But a part of it was also that I wanted to try and make it seem like there was a deep care between them and a familiarity between them that would sort of, when you later on realize that familiarity between people makes it easier to steal their soul, that when you look back at this moment, you go, oh, they had that sort of loving connection. But, I mean, they're obviously going to have that. So maybe I could just keep it in the moment where Dahl comes down the embankment, or Cade comes down the embankment, the moment where it sort of seems to fit, and remove it from the other one. Or just rewrite it, I can understand that if there's a giant monster somewhere and your grandson runs towards you, that you sort of try and hug him or get him close to you in a sort of paternal, sort of loving way that maybe doesn't need to be described as like a look of love and concern. Like, maybe it just needs to be rewritten. But yeah, so that's this chapter. I hope you liked the video, and I will see you next time with chapter 6. Cheers.